Hello. I want to say, first of all, thank you to Roseville Lutheran. My name is Mark Tranvik. I teach Reformation history and theology at Luther Seminary. Previously, I was at Augsburg University for 25 years in their religion department, and I want to say thank you, like I said at the start, to Roseville Lutheran for this opportunity to be a part of your Adult Forum series, especially during this election season. Thank you too, a shout out to Georgia Nygaard for inviting me, and in our conversations together we talked about how it might be interesting to talk about the connection between the election season and what it means to be a Lutheran, and in particular Martin Luther. So I developed a two-part series. The first part, which we're doing now, is called Martin Luther the Politician? Question, question, question. And the second part will be talking a little bit more in contemporary terms about our own faith and the upcoming election. So we're going to start out with Martin Luther the Politician. And of course, this is not a typical way that most people think about Martin Luther. Luther is usually seen, as you can see in the slide here, as a preacher or a teacher, which he was. But some people failed to remember that he was deeply involved in the politics of his day as well. And it's a little bit of a misnomer to say he was a politician, but certainly had a calling in the realm of politics, which we'll talk about in a moment. But before we get to Luther's own involvement in politics, I kind of got to set this up by talking about Luther's understanding of vocation or calling, because this concept of vocation is going to be crucial for us to think about what it might mean to bring our faith into the political realm. And so I want to start out by, it's going to seem a little bit like a detour. We're going to talk about Luther's understanding of vocation, and then we're going to locate him and his political understanding within that framework of vocation. And we're also going to use vocation then to think about our own involvement in politics as citizens and our calling to be citizens. And that will be more in the second series as well. So first of all then, just a quick refresher on vocation, this concept of vocation, which was so central for Luther and his understanding of what it meant to be a faithful person. Vocation, or having the sense of calling, vocation, calling. Vocation is sometimes misunderstood in our day and age because we think of it almost exclusively as maybe like vocational, like a vocational school or job training or something like that. But in Luther's understanding, and what I'm going to encourage you to maybe embrace, is to think about vocation in a much wider sense, a much bigger framework. And let me explain a little bit about that. And we need to go back to Luther's time, 500 years ago, in order to understand this. As you see in the slide, vocation in Luther's time belonged to the monk, the nun, the priest. They were what we call kind of the spiritual athletes of the day. In other words, they were the ones who had callings or vocations. Nobody else did. The monk, the nun, the priest, by virtue of their vow of poverty, chastity, obedience, they had set themselves aside for this separate life, and their life was deemed to be more holy, and they were more holy, and therefore they had vocations. So that word vocation was limited to that certain class of people. All the rest of the people then did not have callings or vocation. And that included Luther, of course, when he started out. It included his parents, who were not religious in terms of being a monk or a nun or a priest, of course. And basically it included most people. They were without a sense of calling or vocation, according to this definition. So the monastic life then, the spiritual athletes, stood for a life that was basically a life apart. And it can lead to this way of thinking. In order to be truly religious, one must separate from the world. And the world is simply secular. It runs on its own. So if you're really going to be religious, what you have to do is dedicate yourself supposedly 24/7 full-time to God. Take a vow of poverty, chastity, obedience, and that then constitutes your vocation. And the rest of the people did not have vocations, as I've said earlier. And this way of thinking then often involves dividing the world into two separate spheres. You have the sacred sphere, which has to do with things spiritual, God up in heaven, and you have the secular sphere, which has to do with the physical, the temporal, the changing, the lower level. And of course, those with vocations are in the higher level, and those without vocations are in the lower level. Okay, so that's Luther's context. So let's take a little bit of a look at Luther's life and see, and it's fascinating, how he demolishes this whole way of thinking. It's really radical what he's up to here. You may not think of Luther as a radical. Think of this old guy a long time ago, 500 years ago, said some important things. But I want to make the case that particularly in this area, he was radical. So let's take a look at Luther's story. I'm not going to go into any great detail, but how he's going to challenge then this understanding of vocation that he inherits, and how it's then going to shape then the Lutheran tradition. So Luther, you have his birth and death years there, 1483 to 1546, just to orient you a little bit. And if you remember a little bit about Luther's story as a young man in accordance with his father's wishes, after graduating from what we would call kind of like college or university, he was going to go to graduate school, and his father wanted him to be a lawyer, probably to make the Luther name great. His father Hans, after all, was a miner, and he saw his son elevating himself, and so he pushed him into law school, and Luther said, okay, I'll go to law school. And for a while, not very long, 3 months, he actually attended law school in his area of north central Germany. But at the age of 22, short time after he'd started law school, he has this remarkable interruption in his life. He's out walking home one day from school, and he's out in the countryside in the region known as Saxony, and a horrible thunderstorm happens. And Luther fears for his life in the midst of the storm. The lightning flashes, the thunder's roaring, and he thinks it's all over and he's going to die. And in his fear, he gets down on his knees and he prays to Saint Anne. Saint Anne in those days was the patron saint of miners. She was the saint in the Roman Catholic understanding who protected miners. And so Luther, probably as he had done many, many times before, prayed to Saint Anne, and he said, Saint Anne, please save me from this storm, and if you do, I will become a monk. Storm passed, Luther lived, and now he'd made a vow heard by God, a vow that he couldn't just simply say, well, didn't really mean it, weak moment. No, he'd made a vow, and he made a huge switch. He left law school and entered a monastery in the German city of Erfurt, a fairly strict monastery. Another kind of interesting thing about this story is that his father, as I told you before, was highly invested in his son being a lawyer. When Luther made this switch, this huge, huge switch to a different kind of calling, that of being a monk, he didn't even tell his father. And that created a rift in their relationship that lasted, for 15 to 20 years. You can imagine his father's disappointment when his son, that he saw destined for this worldly success and a legal career, and all of a sudden now he's switched lanes completely and entered this strict monastery in Erfurt. And in the monastery, to make a long story short, Luther's entering into an experience where he was told the following. You have there a picture of Luther the monk. You can see the tonsure on his head, right, that all the monks had, indicating their enslavement to Christ and the church. And he was also told then, as a monk, that not he who begins, but he who perseveres to the end is going to be saved. Not he who begins. I want you to think about that a little bit. Not he who begins, but he who perseveres to the end. In other words, what the church is saying here is you never can be certain. You can never be sure. There's always this edge of fear. You got to keep trying your hardest. You have to persevere to the very end if this is going to turn out well. And this would haunt Luther, this thought, that maybe he wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing. Maybe he wasn't doing enough. And as his time in the monastery went on, he began to reflect. This is a later reflection, and I know you're not supposed to have long quotes on PowerPoints. Excuse me, please, just for a couple of these slides. There's some phrases and words from Luther that I think are too good to be left out. And so Luther said this about being a monk. He said, "I was a good monk, and I kept my orders so strictly that I could say that if ever a monk could get to heaven through monastic discipline, I was that monk. And yet," he says, "my conscience would not give me certainty. But I always doubted, and I said, 'You didn't do that right. You weren't contrite enough. You left that out of your confession.' The more I tried to remedy an uncertain, weak, and troubled conscience with human traditions, the more I found it uncertain and weak and troubled." So Luther's found himself now in quite a fix, right? He's entered into this monastic vocation. The only vocation available to people, right? He's really dedicating himself to God. He's undertaken a vow of poverty. He's promised to be chaste, no sexual relationships, right? And he's going to be obedient then to the church as well. And he's finding that God is here. He's here. He's taking all these steps, he thinks, right, to be a successful monk so he can persevere to the end. But instead of feeling like he's getting closer to God, it's becoming a very frightening spiritual experience. He not only is not getting closer, he finds God's getting further and further away from him. There's now a greater gap between himself and God than he'd ever felt before. And this becomes very frightening for him because as a person of his day and age, that gap indicated if he were to die, that he would not be saved. And of course, the fear, the terror of hell and the final judgment weighed heavily on people in those days. And therefore, Luther's own experience here suggests that he's not doing enough. And I have some slides maybe to indicate what's going on, right? He's always climbing. He's always trying to do better. He's always trying to live up to his vows, his vocation. But it's never, ever, ever good enough. He never feels like he's good enough. And therefore, the end result really happens in two ways, two things. One is you're totally exhausted. It just kills you. And of course, he felt this deeply. And the other possibility is despair. You feel condemned. You feel lonely. You feel desperate. You feel depressed. Luther not only felt all those things, but he also felt that God had turned against him. And so it was a really, really dark moment in his life as well, the struggle that went on in the monastery. Well, picking up on the story then, to make, again, a long story short and make sure we get back to our whole understanding of vocation and how Luther's going to challenge the church's teaching of the day. Basically what happens is that through his study of Scripture, through the counsel of some friends, his father confessor in the monastery, Luther comes to understand that it's not about me getting to God, but rather it's about God coming to me. At first he thought he was supposed to suffer like Jesus. Now he comes to understand that Jesus does something to him, does something for him. In other words, he asks the question, why did Jesus have to die? Only sinners die, but Jesus wasn't a sinner. Doesn't make any sense. And then it dawns on him, and again, this isn't just overnight. This is something that he's reflecting on, studying the Bible, having conversations with others in his community. But it dawns on him, why did Jesus die? The wages of sin is death. You see the logic here? And Jesus dies, but Jesus wasn't a sinner. This seems to upset that whole kind of thinking. And then it dawns on him that Jesus died because he became a sinner. In Luther's famous phrase, Jesus became the greatest sinner of all. He took upon himself all the sin of the world. And Luther stopped and dwelt on that. What does that really mean? And it kind of came to him, right? That if Jesus bearing the sin of the world, he's bearing all the sin of the world, Luther thinks, well, then he's bearing my sin. And if he's bearing my sin, then the sin is not on me. And if the sin's not on me, then I'm, in fact, righteous because of what Christ did for me. I'm free of sin and free in faith It's a whole new way of looking at life. It's a whole new way of looking at faith. It's a whole new way of looking at the world. He thought it was about him climbing, right? And now he understands it's not about him climbing. It's about God's love for the unlovable. Someone like Luther, maybe like you. God's love for the unlovable. And that starts to sink deep into Luther's soul, his heart. And it becomes then clear to him that he's being taught something that's contrary to what the Bible's saying. It's not about going up to God. It's rather about what God in Christ does for us and the great unfathomable depths of God's love for you and for me. And so Luther's challenging then this whole idea of what sometimes is called a transactional theology, right? Transactions are, if you do something, then you get something in return. And of course, we all know the world works that way, right? In order to get paid at work, you have to put in the hours, right? If you're going to be good at a sport, you got to practice. If you're good at a musical instrument, you have to practice. It's an if-then kind of world that we live in. It's transactions. But Luther says, you see, what the problem was, the church of his day had imported that kind of thinking into its understanding of God. And he says, no, the God of the Bible isn't about a transaction. It's not about if you do something, then God's going to reward you. It's rather more because therefore, not if then. Because therefore, because you're a beloved, forgiven child of God. Therefore, you love and serve your neighbor. But it's not about earning it. Whole different way of thinking. So he challenges this ideal. And by the way, the stuff's alive and well out there, folks. Alive and well. A lot of religious people are promoting this kind of thinking. I'd like to challenge you and maybe think deeply about how this idea of transaction has permeated our way of thinking, our culture, our faith communities, and I think it's just false to what the New Testament's really all about. But back to Luther then. So, what does this mean for his own sense of vocation? Well, you can't get there by your works, right? Luther enters the monastic life in pursuit of the only vocation approved by the church of his day, right? The monk, the nun, the priest. He ends up rejecting the monk's life as a true calling, but in turn receives a genuine vocation as a preacher, a teacher, a father, a spouse, a citizen. See what's going on here? How he's changing things up, huh? For Luther, you see, there's no such thing as a second baptism, as sometimes monastic vows were called in those days. You don't get to God by what you do. God makes a vow to us in our baptism. You're named and claimed in Christ. That's the foundation then for your vocation. And here's how it all ties together. Martin Luther has this revolution going now. All Christians are called. See how this works? He's challenging the teaching of the church. The monk, the nun, the priest have vocations. Everybody else is kind of left behind, if you will, left on the world, doing important work, right? But not in any way elevating themselves in God's eyes. So the midwife, the farmer, the blacksmith, they didn't have callings or vocations. What they were doing was taking care of earthly things. But let's not confuse that with the spiritual realm, which the monk, the nun, the priest were devoting themselves to. And Luther's going to come along and say, wait a minute, you don't get there by your works. Good works aren't for God, he'd like to say. God doesn't need your good works. God's doing fine without your good works. But your neighbor needs them. So now all Christians are called, not just the monk, the nun, the priest. All Christians are called. And therefore, our whole life, in fact, is a calling of various kinds. And one of the ways I try to sort of put this together is this way on this slide. You're always called. 365, 24/7. Think about it. There's not a time or a sphere or an episode or an event in your life when you are not a called person. You're called, obviously, to take care of yourself, right? You got to eat right, exercise, get enough sleep. It's important if you're going to love and serve your neighbor and take care of creation. You can't go to excess. It probably doesn't mean, 5 hours a day at the gym. That's something more than taking care of self. That probably borders on selfish. You're in a family, some kind of family. You're called to be a family member, whether that's a spouse or a wife or a husband or a child or a grandchild or a grandparent. In some sense, you're a part of a family. Everybody's part of a family, and that's a calling. You have a calling in work. We're going to skip down below citizen here. You have a calling in your job. Sometimes, unfortunately, vocation gets limited only to our work life, but it's more than that. I mean, we don't want to say that people without work or people who are retired or people who are too young don't have vocations. No. But if in your work's a high calling. In your church community, and being a participant in the church community, in worship and in what other events that you might partake in, that's a calling. Friendship's a high calling. We know how important friends are in our lives. And that's essential then to how we think about, should be essential as to how we think about having a vocation in life. And for our purposes, and what we're trying to talk about here, and yes, eventually we're going to get to politics, you're called to be a citizen. You're called to be a part of your political community as well. It's how you love and serve your neighbor, maybe more at a distance. So the political realm is not, I don't see politics as a dirty word. It's a way we attempt to love our neighbor and take care of creation at more of a distance. And so we're going to explore that a little bit more. You have to trust me on that one. But politics is a high calling. Being a citizen is a high calling. And again, remember, you're always called. There's never a moment in your life when you're not in a station of some kind where this sense of calling doesn't apply. So it's 365, 24/7. And underneath it all, as Luther liked to emphasize, earthly life matters. Being faithful doesn't just mean something spiritual. As Luther liked to say, sometimes the most spiritual thing you could do, maybe, is to change a diaper. You might think, oh, being spiritual means going to worship or praying. Of course, those are spiritual things. But Luther says when you take care of your neighbor, i.e. changing a diaper, he said that's a spiritual thing as well. And so earthly life matters. It's significant. It's not an afterthought. It's not a lower form. So we live out our callings then, not to earn or merit or deserve God's love in any way, but rather God's love is flowing through us out into our love of neighbor and creation. So Luther has really upset the apple cart here and attempted to identify a completely different way of thinking about faith and about life. He's challenged this idea of transactional theology, and he said that faith matters in this life and this earth as the love of God moves through us out into the world. So, let's get into politics. It's really crucial, though, that we set that up with this framework of vocation, because you don't understand Luther's involvement in the political realm, and what I'm going to invite you then to think about, too, in terms of your own involvement, unless you get this framework of vocation, and how that framework was so central for him, and how it developed in contrast to the inherited teaching of his time. So Luther was very involved in the politics of his day, and we'll get into some of the things that he was involved in. Let's start out with controversy. One very controversial episode involved this guy. His name was Thomas Müntzer. He was actually a student of Luther's, but then he moved on into another, as we shall see, another realm altogether. And he lived from 1489 to 1525. So he died fairly young, age of 36. But Müntzer had a unfortunate role, I think we could say, in Luther's life. A little bit about a background about him. He went to Wittenberg and studied with Luther. Remember, Luther's a teacher now at the University of Wittenberg, this small town in Germany. Wittenberg, by the way, is about 60, 70 miles south of Berlin, present sort of location. And you can still go there, by the way, these days and visit Luther's church and his home. It's all been wonderfully preserved. So Müntzer went to Wittenberg, studied with Luther, and he agreed with Luther. He protested against church abuses. He didn't like the hierarchy. But By 1521, though, so very, very early on, he's studying with Luther for a couple, 3 years. Luther recognizes that he's a smart student, but then he begins to distance himself from Luther and sees himself as called by the Holy Spirit to a mission of worldwide significance. So Luther's world is too narrow. It's not big enough for Munzer. Munzer begins to have visions, hear voices. Maybe you can see where this might be headed, unfortunately. And he thinks the Spirit is speaking directly to him. And these revelations then are something leading him to a worldwide, a mission of worldwide significance. So a couple of years later, he's going to leave Wittenberg altogether. He's going to distance himself from Luther. He starts to see himself as a biblical prophet, and he believes that he's sent by God to do war against the godless. And the godless are basically anybody who disagreed, unfortunately, with Munzer. He begins to criticize Luther heavily. So Munzer came out, right, criticizing the Catholic Church as a student of Luther, but now he lumps Luther with the Catholics and everybody else that isn't on his side. He calls Luther a Pope of Wittenberg. He describes him as a lackey of the princes. He derides Luther as Dr. Easy Chair, Dr. Pussyfoot. In other words, Luther's too conservative. He hasn't gone far enough in his Reformation. He hasn't taken it to the ends to which it should be taken. And of course, Munzer says, that's going to be my job. In a fateful move, Munzer then aligns himself with the peasant rebellion that was going on in Germany during the 1520s. So Luther at this time is teaching and preaching in Wittenberg, right? He's been excommunicated, but he's protected by his prince. Munzer emerges from his circle, says Luther's way too conservative, and catches on then with this peasants' rebellion. And we don't have time to get into this in any great detail, otherwise we'll get down in the weeds too much. But the peasants had a very, very difficult life. Their lands were being appropriated by the nobility. There was some bad harvest, there was starvation. You got to remember, about 85 to 90% of the people in Germany at this time were in that realm of peasant. And they'd had enough. They were sick of having this boot in their face, and so there began to be scattered peasant rebellions throughout Germany during these years. Munzer then, he saw these rebellions as something that God had created, and he saw himself then as destined by God to take leadership of the peasants, and he was then going to overthrow all the powers that be, whether they're part of Luther or the Roman Catholics, and lead this rebellion. So that's Munzer, and Luther thus gets drawn into this because he at this time is a pretty famous now reformer, and Munzer's his former student. And Luther has two reactions to the Peasants' Rebellion and to Munzer. The first reaction is kind of interesting. He says, "We have no one on earth to blame for this disastrous rebellion except you princes and you lords and you blind bishops and mad priests. As temporal rulers, you do nothing but cheat and rob the people so that you may lead lives of luxury." Here's a point here, right? Luther is deeply involved in politics at this point. And again and again and again in his preaching and in his letters, he does not hesitate to call upon political powers to change their ways. Whether they're princes or nobles or dukes, he often accuses them of being excessively greedy, of ignoring the needs of their people, of being selfish. And in this case, he says, you know, these peasants and their rebellion, it's because of you guys. You're the ones who are responsible for this. So Luther speaks truth to power. He's definitely mixed up in the politics of his day. So calling Luther a politician is not far-fetched here at all, because he's right in the midst of this peasants' rebellion. And people are coming to him for advice and counsel and listening carefully to what he's saying. Now, I got to be careful. It's not like he's leading. It's not like the princes and dukes are waiting for Martin Luther to speak and then they're going to take action or take his criticism that way. He wasn't that, his influence was not of that type, but he was listened to. He was a significant voice in Germany at this time. But Luther, not only was he upset though with the nobility, the Pope, the Prince, the bishops, all those folks for what they had done to cause this rebellion in the first place with their selfish lives. Luther was also upset with the peasants for resorting to force and claiming that their cause was Christian. So here's what happened with the peasants. They thought Luther would be on their side. Not only were they, I suppose, pleased that Munzer had taken up with them, but they thought maybe Luther would join them as well. After all, he talked about the freedom of a Christian. He very much then criticized the Pope and the Church and the hierarchy and its wealth and abuses. So they saw him as a natural ally. Moreover, they said, our cause is not only just, it's also a Christian cause. And that rankled Luther as well. We'll see why. Later, when Luther received word that the rebellion had become incredibly violent, in one area not far from where he was, over 60 castles and monasteries and convents were burnt to the ground, he reacted with harsh words. So this is another way of Luther's. So Luther's got two kind of voices going here with regard to the peasants' rebellion, right? First, he directs a blast toward the nobility and the Pope and the bishops and the Church and the hierarchy and the rich. And he says, this rebellion happens because you guys are selfish. And then when the rebellion gets out of hand, in his mind, and there's chaos and anarchy, then he says some very harsh things to the peasants themselves. He says, rebellion is not just simple murder. It is like a great fire, which attacks and devastates an entire land. It leads to murder, bloodshed. It makes orphans and widows and turns everything upside down. Therefore, let everything, and this is the unfortunate phrasing here, therefore let everyone who can smite, slay, and stab, remembering that nothing is more poisonous, hurtful, or devilish than a rebel. It is just as when one must kill a mad dog. If you do not strike him, he will strike you and the whole land with you. So he wrote then this tract called Against the Robbing and Murdering Hordes of Peasants. And unfortunately, again, I got to be careful, right? Historically, it's not like the dukes and the bishops and the princes were saying, okay, Martin Luther's told us to go put down this rebellion, therefore we're going to do it. They were acting on their own, independently of Luther, but Luther was writing now against the rebellion itself and against what the peasants were doing. And in a rather unfortunate move, the full force then of the people in power, the church hierarchy, and the dukes, the political authorities, they came down very, very hard on the peasants in a famous battle, at a place called Frankenhausen in Germany. And in this particular battle, just to give you a sense of the massacre that occurred, something like 6,000 to 7,000 peasants were killed. In frightful kinds of ways. And on their side, the princes and the dukes and the political authorities representing the powers that be, right, that were ruling Germany, they only lost 6 people. And so it was a horrible massacre. Munzer was killed during this as well. He was leading the peasants in the rebellion. So he died as a result of this battle. And this show of force then effectively put down the peasants' rebellion. So you have Luther here kind of operating on both sides, but it's a very difficult part of his legacy, especially some of the words or phrases that he was using there, and especially when you talk about, smite, slay, stab, a mad dog, that kind of language. Obviously, you can't excuse it. You can just wish he hadn't said it. It was a highly unfortunate way to think about the rebellion. So a question for us today then is, what is the relationship between faith and politics? Well, using Luther as our guide, we could kind of put it down this way. One possible way between faith and politics is to promote the idea of theocracy or rule by God. See, Munzer saw himself as appointed by God to rule. There were no need for any political authorities. There was no need for any deliberations. He was receiving direct revelation from God, and that revelation from God authorized him then to rule. So God rules through his appointed representatives, and sometimes these representatives are self-appointed as well. In our day and age, maybe the best example of a theocracy might be the present political situation in Iran, where you have an Ayatollah and a clergy that kind of run the show. You have a political have a government too that obviously is there as well, but they have to take their cues finally from the religious authorities. Okay, so that might be an example. So that's one way then of attempting to think about the relationship between faith and politics: theocracy, rule by God. Another way to think about faith and politics, and this was common in Luther's day, was withdrawal from society, total separation, saying the world is what it is, it's basically going to hell in a handbasket, we don't want anything to do with it as Christians, right? We don't want to get our hands dirty, so what we're called to do is to separate ourselves from the world and to find a place that is not tainted by the world. So complete separation. Maybe an extreme of this is the Amish, where, of course, they separate themselves into communities, often rural communities, almost always rural communities, where they see themselves then as separate from the rest of the world, and they govern their lives, but they basically don't want anything to do with voting or taxes or the school system or anything else that we would call sort of public life, right? So they stay separate. So that's another possibility, right? So I'm laying before you, and of course, the Amish go back to the Reformation period, because there were groups then, in Luther's day and age, who were reacting to the Roman Catholic Church by saying what we must do is completely separate ourselves. And those folks were the ancestors of the Amish. They were known as the Anabaptists. So you have two things going on, right, in Luther's day and age. You have the extreme of theocracy or the extreme of separation. Rule by God or rule by removing yourself. And I think there's a sense in which for the average person today, maybe in the pew, faith and politics don't really belong together either. I mean, yes, I recognize it's important to vote, but basically the two remain kind of separate. There's a slight overlap, but religion's what I do with my private life. Religion's the matters, it has to do with matters spiritual, whereas politics is, out there in the world. That's a different realm altogether. And let's not confuse that with anything religious or anything that has to do with faith. There's kind of a separation there. I think a lot of people go there. And most ominously, in the 20th century, we have the examples of what happened to the German church during the Nazi period. And of course, we should be very careful in our criticism of the Christians in those times, because they were put in a very, very difficult situation. But basically what happened was that faith and politics inhabited two separate spheres, right? So they would go to church on Sunday, and that was what faith had to do. That was the location of their faith, in a church or faith community. But then God had also appointed the political authorities, and the political realm kind of ran on its own, right? So God had appointed the judges and the police and the folks then in the hierarchy of government, and you kind of left that alone. And of course, that can work to a certain extent as long as this side is working well, but what happens when Adolf Hitler and Nazis come to power? And then all of a sudden, the separation of faith and politics can take a very devilish kind of turn. Of course, the Lutherans in Germany learned that to their chagrin, the Catholics too, but especially the Lutherans in northern Germany. Anyway, keeping faith and politics separate, or keeping faith separate. So assessing Luther's role in politics then, I would suggest the following. Luther saw the political realm as something in which we're to be active, involved, and engaged in the world. What he did with regard to the peasants is not defensible. It's horrible. Those words were horrible. So I'm not advocating that. Please know that. But you got to remember, in the 16th century, it was a chaotic time. And Luther also always preferred order to any kind of anarchy, and he would choose order over any kind of anarchy, and therefore his words against the peasants can't be defended, but at least you can understand a bit where he's coming from, given that he thought it was a real threat to order. But The other way is then, though, a refusal to baptize politics or claim that their way was the Christian way. One of the reasons he finally then opposed the peasants was that they claimed they were a Christian movement. And Luther didn't like that either, wasn't comfortable with that, because by what authority do you declare yourself Christian? We're going to talk about this a lot in the next section as well, but there's no such thing as a Christian politics, and therefore Luther was upset with the sort of Christian way of, or that way of characterizing their movement as Christian. And thus you have instead his development of what happens to be called the two kingdoms idea, where Luther says the one God develops two kingdoms by which to rule the world. The kingdom on the right is the kingdom of the gospel. That's not the transactional stuff, right? That's the place where you're loved and accepted and forgiven by God in Jesus Christ. And that's an important realm. And then you have the realm then of the left-hand side, and that's the state. And the state's job is to preserve order. And you can't run a state by Christian principles, nor do you want to run a church by the principles the state has to order itself. And thus you have the two kingdoms, one God, two kingdoms. Unfortunately, what often happens in this understanding is that the kingdom on the left, the governmental side, tends to run on its own, while the kingdom on the right tends to be the place where the people of faith inhabit, and they never combine them into the one realm. So there's probably some problems with thinking about two kingdoms. I mean, properly understood, I think it works, but people often find it very confusing in practice, and maybe the spatial image of kingdoms and the almost inevitable separation that happens causes some problems. Anyway, we'll talk about that next time as well. So that's Luther's own role in politics, right? But I also want to say that the best of the Lutheran tradition has always seen citizenship, or our calling to be citizens, as a high calling. So politics is not dirty. Politics is not something to be avoided. Politics is not something beneath us. Politics is not something that the people of faith avoid. No, you're going to be involved in your political realm. You have a calling as a citizen to be involved in your political realm. As we shall see, that can take a number of shapes and forms, but we always see citizenship as a high calling. Karl Barth, who wasn't a Lutheran but was a famous 20th century theologian, said, "A good Christian always has the Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other." Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. In other words, staying informed about the world and what's going on in the world, and not seeing that as separate of faith, but going hand in hand with faith as he or she walks in the world. So let's take a little bit of a look then at a summary of where we've gone today. It's kind of been a twisting road, and I really hope you come back for the second session, because I want to pull some of this together for our contemporary life. But if you remember, we started out with Luther, right? We are saved by grace through faith. And earthly life matters. Religion isn't just a spiritual affair, it's an earthly affair as well. We live out our faith through our vocations. You're always called, 365, 24/7. You can't help but have a calling in life as a Christian. So faith is for this life. Again, back to Luther's words, good works aren't for God. God doesn't need your good works, but your neighbor does. The world does. Creation does. Huh? And as we see through Luther's life, that means a calling in politics as citizens, right? And Luther's legacy is complicated. At the one hand, he thrusts us into the world, faith, active, and love. On the other end, he was very courageous in the way he engaged in the political realm. On the other hand, he was doing this 500 years ago. It was pre-democracy, pre any kind of notion of government freedom, people having the right to vote and participate. So it's hard to make a one-to-one correspondence between what Luther was up to and apply it directly to our time. But he did see our calling, right, as citizens, as a high calling. And it's a way through which then our faith is active in the world. And in our next section, then, we're going to take a look at just what that might mean and what that looks like then for ourselves today. And we'll bring it right home to the election coming up in a couple of months. So, thank you.